So today the question is, well, what if others saw the UFO too? What about that? All right, so this is Thursday, December 19th. What's up with that? UFOs. And today we're talking further about close encounters. In particular, we're talking about a few specific case histories of UFOs and how we can see the overall landscape of what they mean to everything and how it works. So this is 26 2nd Avenue. Every Thursday we're here between 7 and 8:30. And that's 26 2nd Avenue at East 1st Street. So if you live in the area, you can come on down and add to the conversation. The YouTube channel is Krishna Was Up, KRISHNAWAZZUP. So you can find us on the YouTube. And if you find it somewhere else, then that's the YouTube channel that I'm using. So I'm getting pretty good. Mostly last week's is up. I'm breaking these into two sections, even though I'm recording them on one night, but I just want them to be a little bit easier to digest, so I'll put them in like 30, 45-minute sections. So tonight, again, I'll break it into two sections. And another announcement is that next week there'll be nothing, and the week after that there'll be nothing, because it's the holidays, and I myself have a bunch of obligations that I have to tend to. So our next session will be January 9th in 2020. All right, 2020. What an interesting sounding year. We'll see what 2020 has got in store for us. And on January 9th, we're going to move into the area of government conspiracies. We're going to talk about that. All right, what's up with that? So the first thing I want to talk about here is an overview of what I hope to discuss today. And the first four of them I'm going to discuss in the first half, and the second four of them I'm going to discuss in the second half of the video presentation. For those of you who are in our audience here, it will just be on the same day, but it'll come into two sections. So we're going to talk a little bit about these things that are attending to UFOs: traces, multiple witnesses, statistical pooling, videos, and even debris and actual craft themselves. So these are things that are part of the whole UFO phenomenon. And those who are skeptics, they really have to in some way try to debunk or remove these things. But this is what makes the whole idea of the UFO reality much more tangible. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about, these are some specific case histories, which are interesting in themselves. North Bergen, New Jersey, 1975. Exeter, New Hampshire, 1965. Via Santina, Italy, 1950. Newark Valley, New York, 1964. Villares del Saz, 1953. These are, you'll see some of these are in other countries. And of course, Trans-et-Provence in France, 1982. And we're going to talk a little bit about the official Betty and Barney Hill, probably the most well-known of all the abductees. The first, definitely, abductee case. These are what I hope to cover, and I'm going to go through the first four, and then I'll go through 5 through 9. So stick with us here. We'll see how we go. So these are types of corroborating evidence: physical traces, multiple witnesses, statistical pooling, photos and videos, radar, electromagnetic disturbances, and actual craft or debris. Often when we have the UFO phenomenon take place, it doesn't happen that we're just having to deal with personal testimony. Actually, the whole idea of the UFO phenomenon is a lot like what goes on in an actual courtroom. when you're at a trial, you begin to see that the lawyers on both sides, they present arguments and they present testimony. And usually testimony is the largest part of the argument in a courtroom. Of course, sometimes there is some physical evidence, and in that case, the lawyers will certainly bring it up and introduce it to the people in the courtroom in some way or another, because this is the nature of how they make their case. But in many cases, there's not much physical testimony, physical evidence. Mostly, it's testimony, and still, judges have to make a decision. The jurors have to make a decision, and mostly, it's based on testimony. So we see that, as Richard Thompson says, that these testimonies are maybe not completely watertight in themselves. They can certainly, you can imagine the people are mistaken or lying or confused or misremembering or whatever. And there may be details that are like that. But there's also physical traces. There's actual real life artifacts that are there and have to be thought about as well. So this is what makes the idea of thinking about UFOs more than just wishful thinking or true believers. But of course, as I've been talking about, there are the true disbelievers. So a lot of people run into them. People who just can't be convinced that there's anything outside of what they've seen and what can be measured in some laboratory somewhere. All right, so physical traces we'll be seeing some evidences of physical traces in some of the case histories that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And there are examples where there's holes in the ground, where there are examples of footprints that are not the kind of footprints we're used to seeing. There's examples of places where the craft had touched down, and what's there now is some kind of burn mark, or there's some kind of unusual situation left behind as a result of the craft touching down and taking off again. There's changes in the plant life. There's changes in deposits of various kinds of minerals or something like that. So there is some there is some kind of actual physical left behinds. And this is what is interesting, because oftentimes the people investigate these, various researchers, and they discover things that don't make any sense or things that they can't actually explain. So physical traces. Now, multiple witnesses, I think, is the strongest evidence for the real UFO truth of the UFOs, because I don't know how you explain that numbers of people who don't know each other give a testimonial about witnessing something and describe a very similar thing at the same time. And I don't know how you would make that possible if you were trying to stage it in some kind of way. Of course, one of the things that we're going to talk about, probably give a session to at some point, is this new idea that people are surfacing. They call it mass hysteria, whatever that's supposed to be. It's not a very well-researched topic. It's hard to find any information about it. It just sounds to me more or less like some kind of pigeonhole that a certain kind of person wants to throw the UFO phenomenon into that pigeonhole and try to get rid of it in that way, that it's just people having some kind of mass delusion. How they would have a mass delusion, how they would agree on what the mass delusion is, why it would be so specific, none of these things can be actually explained. All right, so multiple witnesses is definitely a strong kind of corroborative evidence for the reality of the UFO phenomenon. Statistical pooling is interesting. There are researchers, and Richard Thompson also was a statistician, a mathematician and statistician. They did various things where they went through lots and lots of UFO accounts and just put together what similar things there were within these accounts. And they found that statistically they would come into something like 7 or 8 different groupings. These different groupings would be, would have similar characteristics. The size of the UFO, Oh yeah, if you could take your shoes off, please. Yeah, the size of them, the condition, the whether there were visible occupants, et cetera, et cetera. So this is also a part of the whole overall interesting way of taking a look at this whole phenomenon. So statistical pooling is something that doesn't get done very often, but it becomes obvious after some time that there are repeat or a lot of similar characteristics. Not everyone that reports actually seeing the beings that come out of the UFOs reports the same kind of being. But it's not like each report is a completely different kind of being. They fall into several categories. And even the shapes of the UFO, it's not that every person reporting a UFO reports a completely different kind of craft. They fall into certain categories. The kind of experiences that people have, they fall into certain categories too. The paralyzing ray that some people talk about, the idea of lights rotating, the idea of some kind of landing gear, the idea of the aliens being smaller than humans. These are things that come up again and again and again when we describe this whole phenomenon. So we have the statistical pooling. Of course, photos and videos. At one point in our past, come on in. Do me a favor and take your shoes off, though. So at one time in the past, photos and videos were very strong evidence. But of course, since the advent of Photoshop and similar kinds of software, you can do literally anything. And it's impossible to know whether that was a genuine photograph or whether it was photoshopped, because people are expert at this now, understanding how the light comes in and how to put things in a certain way to make it look like they're together, and doing the same kind of shading and all this. And you can do practically anything you want with photos, or certainly even videos. There was, I think 2 years ago, a real famous, completely fabricated video of something, I think, in the Caribbean that somebody was shooting, but it was definitely CGI'd. All right, so, but the interesting thing is there was a time before people were so good at this, and some of these photos are from before that. There's an interesting thing. I'm pulling these photos. There's a website that is associated with MUFON, where they have photos of various UFOs and what they looked like. And it's interesting that the clearer photos, the mind automatically thinks this must have been photoshopped, but the fuzzier ones, we think, oh, maybe that's a real one. So there's nothing that says the fact that it's clear means it has to be photoshopped. It could be a real picture. But of course, there's no way to tell. So that's why, unfortunately, these days, photos and videos don't add much credibility to the UFO phenomenon. Many times we see that radar is involved, that these flying craft do show up on radar. And there's even radar traces and so on and so forth that go along, especially with some of the military accounts of UFO sightings and encounters. And of course, the one that happened earlier this year, where they released it from the U.S. Navy Air Force. So there was some kind of, chase of some UFO, and it's on video, and the pilots are talking, and it's got a radar trace, and it shows it in the radar lock-on. So, at any rate, that's a thing that's corroborating item. We have electromagnetic disturbances. This is something that pops up a lot in the whole UFO phenomenon. Yeah, no, just push the door too, so it doesn't pop back open again. We've got that cord running through the top, so it should be all right. So oftentimes, people report when they see or encounter a UFO that what they notice is that electronic things stop working, or the car ignition stops working. That's reported quite commonly, that there's something that these UFOs do that stop the normal function of electronic gadgets, So, of course, the last corroborative evidence is actual craft or debris. And, of course, this is one thing that you just ain't never going to see, because the military is really good at scooping up and whisking this stuff away so that no one will ever see it or know that it ever was there. Of course, Roswell is the poster child for this kind of thing. That first they came out with a story that the Air Force found a genuine UFO, and then a few hours later, a completely different story came out. So there are instances where credible people who were involved in the military actually saw this debris or various other aspects of it. And, of course, the government got rid of it right away. And for obvious reasons, that we can't have this stuff floating around. So that the government is, we'll talk about that on January 9, the idea of government conspiracies, why exactly the government has to go through this elaborate effort to debunk every and absolutely every one of these possible sightings and whatever. So here's some actual case histories. This is North Bergen, New Jersey, 1975. Bud Hopkins was the investigator here. Those of you who know Bud Hopkins, he actually he was an artist, a graphic artist, and he was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, and wound up coming to New York City and meeting some of the main artists of New York City, Rothko and Hepplewhite and some of these other big name people. And he somehow got interested in investigating UFOs. And this became his main theme. He began to investigate all kinds of different UFO phenomena. He passed on early this decade, somewhere I think in 2004 or something like that. He went through a lot of different cases. This is one case that he investigated. This happened in New Jersey and North Bergen in 1975. And what's interesting about this particular, instance was that there's a number of different witnesses who independently saw the same UFO. And because they saw the same UFO, it makes it seem like how could all these people come together and come up with the same story. It starts off with this man named George Obarski. So this is who Bud Hopkins talked to first. He was a guy, owned a liquor store somewhere on the Upper East Side, and lived in North Bergen, came across the bridge and across the Hudson. And as he was driving, he saw a large, he said, 30-foot craft glowing overhead, and he followed it, and he saw it land in, I guess, evidently some kind of sports field somewhere in North Bergen. And he went up to it, and he saw, various slits and windows in it, and he saw it arrive, and he saw it leave, I'm not sure whether he saw any of the occupants or not. I don't remember that. But what's interesting is that Bud Hopkins researched this, and one of his associates was giving a talk on UFOs at a PTA somewhere in the same area. And other people came forward. This Bill Pawlowski, who was actually a doorman at a place called Stonehenge Apartments, and he saw the UFO on that same night. That was close to where Obarski was, and he saw it as well. He has an associate works on different days than him, Bill Pawlowski, named Frank Gonzalez, who also works at Stonehenge. They're doormen, and these are security people too. And Frank Gonzalez saw it, but he saw it on a different night. And then there was this Walmsley family who lives not at Stonehenge, but somewhere close by, a few blocks away. And they also, on that same night, the reason they could figure this was the same night is they all reported the fact that although this was January, that it was very warm. So that you don't get many days like that. And on this particular year, many of these people corroborated this same strange feeling that they were out there watching this UFO and it wasn't very cold, even though it was January. So these were looked at by another researcher called Bertold Schwarz. And Schwarz was, he's a psychologist. And so he was interested in what these people are like. And of course, we could look at this particular story here. You've got all these different witnesses who saw essentially the same thing. They're giving the same account, the same story. And each one is independent of one another. Maybe we could tie Bill Pawlowski and Frank Gonzalez together because they obviously work for the same apartment complex. But the other people had no knowledge of each other. So this is an example of corroborating evidence by multiple witnesses seeing the same thing. Here we're looking at Exeter, New Hampshire, 1965. By the way, these photographs don't necessarily go with these stories. They're just photographs, and the story is separate. I couldn't find photographs for each one of these things, obviously. So I'm just taking photos from this MUFON picture website. So this happened in September in 1965 in Exeter, New Hampshire. And their investigator here was Raymond Fowler. And so he was explaining about this. And evidently, there was a craft that went overhead very slowly, very low, and was very bright, and it had reported red lights. So someone called a police officer named Eugene Bertrand to go investigate it. He met two women in a car who were terrified. He talked to them, and they said that they had been followed by this large glowing object for several miles in that area. And he just thought they'd had a little too much to drink or something like that. But when he got back to the police station, there was a young man there named Norman Muscarello, who was 18 years old, who had been hitchhiking in the same area. And he saw the object as well. So now, Bertrand is thinking, maybe I really should go check this out. You've got two different people reporting the same thing, or actually in this case probably three. People aren't sure whether it's one or two women that were frightened in the car. And then so Bertrand and Muscarello go back to where Muscarello saw the UFO, and as they get back, they both of them see it take off. And in this way, later, there's another officer named David Hunt who also sees the same object. So here we have, again, a group of people, not just one person, but a group of people seeing more or less the same thing. How was it written up in the newspapers? It was debunked as an advertising airplane. There's some kind of advertising airplane in that area, but research shows that it wasn't in the air during that time period. And the military was performing this military exercise called Big Blast Cocoa, where they were doing some refueling thing. And so again, those who want to just write the whole thing off think, well, maybe this was part of it. But of course, again, if you do research, you find that this Big Blast Cocoa wasn't happening at the same time. So you have several people seeing the same thing, some of them being police officers, and at the same time we have, this, the way the debunking comes up with somebody just grasping at straws to try to come up with something to discredit that this could possibly be an actual real-life event.